Detective Agatha Marple, The Last Stop on the Orient Line train. A detective tales. The last stop on the Orient Line gleamed in the morning sun as it awaited its passengers at the bustling station in Istanbul. Its polished brass fixtures and deep green carriages spoke of elegance, promising a journey steeped in luxury. Agatha Marple, a diminutive woman with a keen eye and an unassuming air, paused on the platform to admire the spectacle before her. Dressed in a modest but impeccably tailored traveling suit, she carried a small leather valise and an expression of quiet curiosity. The station was alive with the sounds of porters shouting instructions, passengers chattering in various languages, and the faint hiss of steam escaping the train's engine. The atmosphere brimmed with anticipation, the sort that came before embarking on an adventure. Agatha made her way aboard, greeting the uniformed steward who ushered her into the opulent first-class carriage. Inside, the train was a marvel of refinement. The corridors were narrow but lined with polished wood paneling and inlaid with brass accents. Plush carpets muffled footsteps, and the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of leather upholstery. Agatha's compartment was small but exquisitely appointed, with velvet drapes framing the window and a delicate vase of fresh flowers on the table. Settling into her seat, Agatha allowed her gaze to wander as passengers filed past her cabin. A young woman with an air of nervous energy clutched a book, as if it were a talisman. A stately older man, clearly a scholar by his manner, frowned at his pocket watch. A glamorous couple, bedecked in jewels and finery, exchanged whispered words in a language Agatha recognized as French. Each face told a story, and Agatha, posing as a historian, was determined to learn as many as possible. When the whistle blew and the train pulled away from the station, the world outside the window became a blur of sunlit domes and bustling streets. Inside, however, the stage was set for intrigue, and Agatha Marple was prepared to play her role. The dining car of the Orient Express was the pinnacle of opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the polished mahogany tables, which were set with fine china and silverware. Passengers dined beneath the watchful eyes of uniformed waiters, the soft hum of conversation creating a harmonious backdrop. Agatha was seated near the center of the car, her unobtrusive presence granting her an excellent vantage point. Across the room, Dr. Percival Harrington, a tall man with a booming voice and a commanding presence, held court at a table of captivated listeners. His white mustache quivered as he regaled the room with tales of his latest expedition. And there it was, Harrington declared, his voice rising dramatically, buried beneath centuries of sand, a relic unlike any other. The craftsmanship alone suggests it predates recorded history. The audience murmured in appreciation, though not all faces were equally enraptured. Dr. Evelyn Montague, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp features and a steady gaze, tapped her fork against her plate in quiet irritation. Beside her sat Sir Julian Blake, a stout man with an air of practiced joviality. He leaned back in his chair, a smile that didn't reach his eyes fixed on Harrington. "I suppose you've brought this wonder aboard with you, Dr. Harrington?" Sir Julian asked, his tone light but edged with something darker. "It must be a sight to behold." Harrington's chest puffed with pride. "Indeed, Sir Julian, I would not dream of leaving such a treasure unattended. But I must warn you all," he added with a dramatic pause, "this artifact comes with a history, one of misfortune. Some might even call it cursed." A ripple of nervous laughter traveled through the dining car. Madame Dubois, a striking woman with a penchant for expensive jewelry, leaned forward with interest. "Cursed, you say? How deliciously ominous." Agatha noted the flicker of unease that crossed Dr. Montague's face. "Superstition, nothing more," Montague said briskly. "Science deals in facts, not fairy tales." "And yet," Harrington countered, his eyes gleaming, "history is riddled with curses, Dr. Montague. Just as it is riddled with greed, betrayal, and murder." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling like an unseen shadow. Agatha sipped her tea, her mind already piecing together the dynamics at play. Professional rivalries, strained alliances, and whispers of a cursed artifact. There was much to unravel, and the train had only just departed. The conversation resumed, but the undercurrent of tension lingered. Agatha's gaze swept the room, noting the flickers of resentment in Montague's eyes, the calculating tilt of Sir Julian's head, and the barely contained glee on Harrington's face. The artifact might have been the centerpiece of Harrington's tale, but it was the people surrounding him who truly intrigued Agatha. As the train pressed on through the Turkish countryside, Agatha leaned back in her chair, her hands resting lightly on the table. She had come aboard the Orient Express, seeking answers about history, but it was clear she would find far more than she had anticipated. The last stop on the Orient Line sped through the dusky Turkish countryside, the rhythmic clatter of its wheels creating a steady backdrop for the symphony of polished conversation and clinking cutlery in the dining car. The room, aglow with the light of its crystal chandeliers, exuded an air of refinement. Each passenger appeared perfectly at ease, or tried to appear so. Agatha Marple sat quietly at her table, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her expression that of mild interest. The untrained eye might have dismissed her as a quaint, harmless woman absorbed in her thoughts, but Agatha was anything but idle. Her sharp eyes roamed the room, cataloguing every glance, every fidget, and every carefully chosen word. Dinner was proving as illuminating as she had hoped. At the far end of the car, Dr. Percival Harrington held court, his booming voice drawing amused chuckles and murmurs of interest from his enraptured audience. "I assure you," he declared, waving his wine glass for emphasis, "this artifact is not only genuine but unparalleled in its significance. The craftsmanship, the detail, it could only have been the work of a civilization far older than we dare imagine." Madame Dubois, seated just a table away, tilted her head slightly, her red-lipped smile both gracious and sharp. "Indeed, Dr. Harrington, and yet I cannot help but wonder where exactly was this extraordinary find unearthed. It sounds almost too good to be true." The table fell momentarily silent. Harrington's smile wavered, but he recovered quickly, raising his chin. "The site must remain undisclosed for now, Madame Dubois. The academic world is rife with opportunists, as I'm sure you understand." "Of course," Dubois replied, her tone honeyed but her gaze unyielding. "And I imagine such an artifact would come with complications, no? Questions of provenance, perhaps?" At this, Dr. Evelyn Montague, seated beside Harrington, shifted uncomfortably. She reached for her water glass, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the stem. Agatha noted the movement, filing it away with quiet precision. Sir Julian Blake, on Harrington's other side, leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes glittering with interest. Harrington, seemingly unbothered, laughed heartily. "The only complication, madame, is the artifact's ability to inspire awe, and perhaps a touch of envy." He cast a pointed look around the room, his gaze lingering on Montague and Blake. "But then, jealousy has always been the shadow of greatness." Madame Dubois's smile widened, though her eyes remained cold. "How fascinating! And is it true, Dr. Harrington, that this relic is said to be cursed?" The word hung in the air, drawing a collective intake of breath from those nearby. A flicker of something passed over Harrington's face, irritation perhaps, but it was gone in an instant. "Ah, the curse," he said, chuckling dismissively. "Merely superstition, I assure you. A relic of this magnitude is bound to inspire wild tales. It's the hallmark of human imagination." Dubois leaned back in her chair, her fingers toying absently with the stem of her wine-glass. "Superstition, yes. And yet," her eyes darted to Montague, whose expression had grown visibly strained. "Superstition often begins with a grain of truth, does it not?" Agatha's gaze shifted to Montague, who was now dabbing at her lips with a napkin, her movements rigid. Sir Julian, for his part, appeared to suppress a smirk. Agatha allowed herself a faint smile, though it was born of curiosity rather than amusement. The dynamics at play here were as intricate as the meal's presentation. "Quite enough of this talk of curses," Harrington declared, his voice booming with forced cheer. "Let us raise a toast to the triumphs of human discovery and the indomitable spirit of exploration." Crystal glasses clinked, and the tension in the room eased on the surface at least. Agatha sipped her wine, her mind working swiftly to connect the threads she had observed. The overt challenge from Madame Dubois, the quiet agitation of Dr. Montague, the detached amusement of Sir Julian, each spoke of histories and motives yet to be unveiled. The train continued its journey, the night outside deepening into inky blackness. Within the dining car, however, the shadows of greed, envy, and ambition loomed just as darkly. Agatha Marple, ever vigilant, knew those shadows would only grow as the journey pressed on. The dining car of the last stop on the Orient Line was alive with laughter and conversation as the passengers dined beneath the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Agatha Marple sat quietly at her table near the rear of the car, enjoying the perfectly cooked sole meunière and listening to the harmonious murmur of voices. The atmosphere was one of cultivated indulgence, a testament to the train's legendary reputation. At the center of the room, Dr. Percival Harrington presided over his table like a king in his court, regaling his companions with tales of ancient treasures and archaeological triumphs. His booming laugh punctuated the din, commanding attention from nearby tables. "I assure you, the dig was treacherous," Harrington declared, his mustache quivering with amusement. "But one does not unearth history's secrets by playing it safe." Just as he raised his glass to punctuate the statement, his expression faltered. He blinked rapidly, his face flushing crimson. A sudden, violent cough interrupted his words. The room fell silent as he clutched at his chest, his movements growing frantic. "Dr. Harrington." Sir Julian Blake rose from his seat, his jovial demeanor replaced by alarm. Harrington's eyes bulged as he gasped for air, his fingers clawing at the tablecloth. The scene unfolded with agonizing clarity, his body spasms before collapsing heavily onto the table, sending glasses and plates clattering to the floor. Screams erupted and chairs scraped against the polished floor as passengers surged to their feet. Agatha remained seated, her expression unreadable but her sharp eyes never leaving the figure slumped over the table. The train's conductor and a steward rushed into the car, followed closely by the ship's doctor, a composed man with silver hair. He knelt beside Harrington, his fingers moving efficiently to check for signs of life. After a tense moment, he straightened, his expression grim. "He's dead." The dining car erupted into chaos. While others were caught up in the confusion, Agatha Marple observed the room with quiet detachment. It was not the spectacle of Dr. Harrington's death that held her attention, but the reactions of the passengers. Panic, fear, and shock rippled through the crowd, but not all reactions were equal. Dr. Evelyn Montague stood frozen, her hands clutching the back of her chair, her face pale but composed. Madame Dubois, ever the picture of elegance, had placed a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine surprise. Sir Julian Blake, on the other hand, seemed less distraught and more calculating, his eyes scanning the room with a peculiar intensity. The conductor attempted to calm the passengers, his voice steady but firm. "Please, everyone, return to your seats. We will sort this out in due course." As the room quieted, a steward hurried in, whispering something urgently to the conductor. The conductor's face tightened as he turned to address the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must ask for your patience. A search of Dr. Harrington's cabin has revealed that an artifact, a small relic of great value, is missing." Gasps rippled through the room. "Stolen?" Madame Dubois asked, her voice sharp. "Surely not." "I regret to say it appears so," the conductor replied gravely. This artifact was of significant historical importance. Agatha noted the ripple of unease that passed through the room. The missing artifact, combined with Harrington's sudden death, had cast a shadow over the evening. She leaned back in her chair, her mind already piecing together the first threads of the puzzle. The conductor cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the room. "I must inform you all that the cabin doors were locked during the dinner service. This is standard protocol to ensure passenger safety while the staff is engaged with dinner preparations." A murmur of confusion swept through the room. Sir Julian raised an eyebrow. "Locked cabins? That seems an unnecessary precaution." "It is the train's policy," the conductor replied, his voice even. "This means that no one could have entered or exited Dr. Harrington's compartment during the meal. But the artifact is missing," Madame Dubois pointed out, her tone tinged with skepticism. "How do you explain that?" Agatha's voice, quiet yet firm, broke through the conversation. "The implication is clear, madame. If the doors were indeed locked, the theft, and perhaps the murder must have been committed by someone seated here in this very room." A heavy silence fell over the dining car as the passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Agatha glanced toward the table where Harrington's body still lay, now partially concealed by a hastily draped tablecloth. Her sharp eyes flickered toward the other passengers, noting every shift in posture, every twitch of a hand. The train rocked gently as it sped through the night, its passengers now bound together by the threads of suspicion and fear. Agatha Marple remained seated, her expression calm, her mind anything but. The clues were there hidden in the chaos, waiting to be uncovered. The train's lounge car was a haven of quiet sophistication. Rich mahogany walls, plush velvet chairs, and soft lamplight lent it an intimate air, a sanctuary from the growing storm of suspicion that clouded the Orient Line. Agatha Marple, knitting needles in hand, sat unobtrusively near a window, the faint clack of the train's wheels underscoring her thoughts. The truth, she knew, was buried not in the details of Dr. Harrington's death, but in the tangled web of human motives surrounding him. Her first stop was Dr. Evelyn Montague, who occupied a corner chair, leafing through a well-worn book. The younger woman's sharp features and brisk movements belied her apparent calm. Agatha approached with her usual air of gentle curiosity. "Such a terrible business," Agatha began softly, lowering herself into the chair opposite. "I hope I'm not intruding. You must be quite shaken." Dr. Montague looked up, startled, then composed herself. "Not at all. It's unfortunate, of course, but Dr. Harrington was not a man who inspired warm feelings." Agatha raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh, I thought the two of you were colleagues." "We were," Montague replied, her voice clipped, though the term implies a level of respect that was not mutual. Dr. Harrington had a way of appropriating the work of others and presenting it as his own, a habit that earned him a fair share of enemies. Agatha's needles clicked rhythmically as she processed the remark. "Enemies indeed," she murmured. "I do hope your work didn't suffer too greatly under his shadow." Montague's lips thinned, but she said nothing, her silence more revealing than words. Sir Julian Blake was next, seated at the bar nursing a glass of brandy. His affable demeanor from the night before had given way to something more somber, his expression thoughtful as he turned the glass in his hands. Agatha slid onto the stool beside him, her presence as unobtrusive as a breeze. "Quite the tragedy," she said conversationally, "and such a prominent figure, too. Dr. Harrington must have been a difficult man to work with." Blake let out a soft chuckle. "That's putting it mildly, Miss Marple. Harrington was a genius, no doubt, but he had the financial acumen of a child, always biting off more than he could chew, promising returns he couldn't deliver. It's a wonder he managed to keep his head above water as long as he did." "Ah," Agatha said, her tone light, "and you were his financial backer, were you not?" Blake gave her a wry smile. "Guilty as charged. Though I suppose you could say it wasn't so much backing as bailing him out time and again. Harrington was deep in debt, you see. Very deep. How unfortunate," Agatha murmured. "Did he owe you much?" "Enough," Blake replied cryptically, downing the last of his brandy. "Enough to make me wish I'd never met him." Madame Dubois was seated in the lounge's most luxurious chair, her gloved fingers delicately cradling a cigarette holder. Her gaze drifted toward the passing scenery as Agatha approached, but her smile was gracious when she turned to greet her visitor. "Miss Marple," Dubois said smoothly, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Oh, I wouldn't call it pleasure, madam," Agatha replied, taking the seat beside her. "This dreadful business with Dr. Harrington weighs heavily on us all. I thought to distract myself with conversation." Dubois gave a faint laugh, exhaling a stream of smoke. "A wise choice, though I must admit, my thoughts are hardly far from the matter. Dr. Harrington's dealings were not always above reproach." "Oh," Agatha said, her curiosity piqued. "What sort of dealings?" Dubois's expression grew coy. "Harrington's ambitions extended beyond academia, you see. He had a taste for the exotic, particularly artifacts of questionable provenance. It's no secret in certain circles that he engaged with the black market to acquire them." Agatha's needles paused mid-click. "Surely not," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Surely so," Dubois replied, her smile sharp. "The artifact in his possession, what do they call it? The cursed idol was a prize, certainly, but one he might have paid dearly for. And not just in coin." Agatha considered this, her expression thoughtful. "A man with secrets, debts, and enemies," she murmured. "No wonder he seemed larger than life." "Larger than life, perhaps," Dubois said, stubbing out her cigarette. "But like all men, mortal in the end." As the train sped toward its next destination, Agatha Marple sat alone once more, her needles moving in time with her thoughts. Montague's resentment, Blake's financial grievances, Dubois's knowledge of the black market. It was a tapestry of motives, each thread pulling the picture tighter. Somewhere in that web lay the truth. All she had to do was unravel it. The train rumbled steadily through the Anatolian countryside, the golden light of late afternoon streaming through the windows of the observation car. Agatha Marple sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, listening attentively to Dr. Evelyn Montague, who had reluctantly agreed to discuss the artifact. "It's called the Idol of Kadesh," Montague said, her tone clipped but precise. "A small carved figure, no more than 6 inches tall. Dr. Harrington claimed it was recovered from a temple site in Syria, though. She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. There's no way to verify that claim. Agatha's keen eyes caught the fleeting bitterness in Montague's expression. You doubt its authenticity? She prompted gently. Montague exhaled sharply. Harrington was more showman than scholar. He knew how to captivate an audience, but his methods were often dubious. The idol's provenance is suspect, to say the least. And then there's the matter of the so-called curse. The curse. Agatha echoed, her voice soft but laced with curiosity. Montague gave a dismissive wave of her hand. Superstitious nonsense. The idol is said to bring misfortune to anyone who possesses it. Harrington loved to embellish such tales, it made his discoveries more marketable. But you don't believe in the curse, Agatha pressed. Of course not, Montague replied firmly. But curses have a way of attracting trouble, especially when artifacts like the idol find their way into the wrong hands. Collectors, dealers, even criminals, it's a sordid business. Agatha nodded, her mind working swiftly. The artifact's dubious origins and Harrington's penchant for embellishment painted a picture of a man who thrived on spectacle. But there was a shadow beneath the glamour, one that hinted at greed, deceit, and perhaps something far darker. Thank you, Dr. Montague, Agatha said with a faint smile. You've been most helpful. As Montague returned to her cabin, Agatha remained in the observation car, her thoughts circling the idol like a bird of prey. A cursed artifact, a murder, and a missing relic. It was a puzzle with too many missing pieces. But one detail stood out. If Harrington had the idol in his possession, where was it now? And had it been the real artifact at all? The corridor outside Sir Julian Blake's cabin was quiet, the hum of the train's engine the only sound. Agatha paused before the door, her gloved hand resting lightly on the brass handle. Sir Julian had excused himself earlier, claiming a headache, and she suspected he would not return soon. It was an opportunity too good to ignore. The cabin was modestly furnished but elegant, the kind of space befitting a man of Sir Julian's stature. Agatha moved with practiced efficiency, her sharp eyes scanning for anything out of place. It did not take long to find it. Tucked inside the drawer of the writing desk was a small glass vial, its stopper missing. Agatha held it up to the light, her brows knitting together in thought. The faint residue at the bottom suggested it had once contained a liquid poison, perhaps. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. The discovery was significant, but it also felt staged. The vial had been too easily found, its placement almost deliberate. Agatha's lips pressed into a thin line as she set it back in the drawer, her mind churning with questions. Why leave such incriminating evidence in plain sight? Sir Julian was a man of considerable intelligence, surely. He would not be so careless. Unless, of course, he had wanted someone to find it. As Agatha straightened, a faint creak behind her sent a chill down her spine. She turned swiftly to find Madame Dubois standing in the doorway, her expression one of amused curiosity. Miss Marple, Dubois said smoothly, stepping inside, I didn't take you for the snooping type. Agatha offered a polite smile, her mind racing to formulate a response. Curiosity, Madame Dubois. It's a habit of mine. Indeed, Dubois said, her gaze drifting toward the writing desk. And did your curiosity yield anything of interest? Not yet, Agatha replied evenly. But one never knows where a clue might appear. Dubois's lips curved into a faint smile. How true. She stepped closer, her eyes glittering. But be careful, Miss Marple. Curiosity can be dangerous. With that, she turned and swept out of the cabin, leaving Agatha alone with her thoughts. The vial of poison was a clue, but whether it was genuine or a red herring remained to be seen. What was clear, however, was that the game was far from over and Agatha Marple was determined to win. The last stop on the Orient Line rattled steadily through the mountains, the surrounding landscape veiled in a soft, misty haze. Within the confines of the train's first-class lounge, Agatha Marple sat at a small table near the corner, seemingly engrossed in her knitting. The soft clack of her needles was a soothing counterpoint to the whispers of conversation that filled the room. She wasn't knitting for leisure, however. Her sharp ears caught every word exchanged between Madame Dubois and Sir Julian Blake, their conversation low but charged. Madame Dubois's voice carried a tone of cool control, while Sir Julian's responses were clipped, his usual jovial air absent. Agatha had no doubt that she was listening to something significant. When Madame Dubois excused herself and drifted elegantly out of the room, Agatha rose with purpose. She caught up to Madame Dubois in the corridor, where the soft glow of brass sconces illuminated her confident stride. "Madame Dubois," Agatha began gently, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a word." Dubois paused, her brow arching ever so slightly. "Miss Marple, you do have a talent for finding me at the most curious times." Agatha smiled. "Curiosity is a habit of mine, I'm afraid." Dubois considered her for a moment before nodding. "Very well. Shall we speak here, or would you prefer somewhere more private?" "The lounge will suffice," Agatha replied, gesturing for them to return. Once seated, Agatha began with the same unassuming warmth that had disarmed many before Madame Dubois. "I've been reflecting on Dr. Harrington's sudden death. Such an unfortunate loss, particularly given the artifact he was transporting." Dubois's expression didn't waver, but her fingers tensed slightly against the edge of her chair. "It is tragic, of course, though, if I may say, his reputation wasn't entirely unblemished." "Indeed," Agatha agreed. "I've heard whispers that he intended to sell the artifact upon reaching Paris. Quite a lucrative endeavor, if true." Dubois's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "The art world is rife with temptation, Miss Marple. I'm sure you understand that such rumors are common." "Oh, I understand," Agatha said, her tone mild. "But I also understand you've had dealings with the collector Roland Vasseur. His reputation in certain circles is colorful, to say the least." Dubois's composure faltered, her gaze narrowing slightly. "You are well informed." Agatha's smile deepened. One must be when traveling in such esteemed company. "Tell me, madame, do you think it possible that Dr. Harrington's death was less about rivalry or jealousy and more about securing his treasure for another buyer?" Dubois leaned back, her fingers now perfectly still. "That, Miss Marple, would depend entirely on who stood to benefit." Agatha nodded, satisfied she had planted the seed of doubt. She let the conversation drift to safer topics, but the look in Dubois' eyes as they parted told her everything she needed to know. Dubois was hiding something, and Agatha was closer than ever to uncovering what. Later that evening, Agatha found herself in the dining car, seated across from Dr. Evelyn Montague. The two women spoke in hushed tones, their conversation masked by the soft hum of other diners. "I must ask for your assistance, Dr. Montague," Agatha said, her voice carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "Did you, by chance, take any photographs of the artifact before Dr. Harrington's death?" Montague blinked, surprised. Yes, I did. As part of the documentation process." "Would it be possible to see them?" Montague hesitated, her gaze wary. But something in Agatha's steady expression must have reassured her, for she nodded. "I have them in my cabin. Wait here." She returned moments later, a small leather-bound notebook in hand. Inside were several photographs, carefully annotated. Agatha studied them closely, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the idol, the intricate carvings, the subtle weathering, the distinct mark at its base. "Fascinating," Agatha murmured. "And yet—" "What is it?" Montague asked. Agatha reached into her handbag, producing a folded handkerchief. From it she retrieved a small figure the idol recovered from Harrington's cabin. She set it beside the photograph and leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "This is not the same artifact." Montague's breath hitched. "Are you certain?" "Quite," Agatha said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "The markings are different, the details less precise. This is a replica, and a poor one at that." Montague's face paled as the implication sank in. "Then the real artifact is missing," Agatha finished, "and likely the key to this entire mystery." The train rocked gently as it continued its journey, the rhythmic clatter of wheels underscoring the gravity of Agatha's discovery. The idol switch was no accident, it was deliberate, calculated, and undoubtedly connected to Harrington's death. Somewhere on the last stop on the Orient Line, a killer had taken great pains to cover their tracks. But they had not counted on Agatha Marple. The rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels served as a constant backdrop to the otherwise silent corridor. Agatha Marple moved purposefully toward the luggage car, her footsteps soft against the thick carpet. The weight of her discovery about the idol gnawed at her thoughts, each step pulling her closer to a truth she suspected would not come without peril. The air shifted as she entered the dimly lit luggage car, the faint scent of polished wood and leather mixing with the metallic tang of cold steel. Stacks of trunks and suitcases lined the narrow space, casting long, eerie shadows in the glow of a single overhead lamp. Agatha paused, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of movement. She was not alone. The realization came as a subtle shift in the atmosphere of presence, unspoken but undeniable. Agatha's heart quickened, though her expression remained calm. Quietly, she stepped forward, her gloved hand brushing lightly against the edge of a trunk. A faint sound, a footfall perhaps, echoed behind her. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady but edged with authority. The silence that followed was deafening, save for the hum of the train speeding through the night. Then came the creak of a door swinging shut. In an instant, the light overhead flickered and dimmed, plunging the car into a maze of shadows. Agatha turned swiftly, her sharp mind racing. Whoever was there intended to trap her. The heavy door to the corridor had been pulled shut, its lock now audible with a decisive click. "Ah," she murmured, her voice tinged with dry amusement despite the situation. "How thoughtful." Moving cautiously, Agatha edged deeper into the car, her senses heightened. She felt the chill of the night seep through the thin walls of the train, heard the faint rustle of fabric to her left. The assailant was waiting, perhaps hoping she would panic and make herself an easy target. But Agatha Marple did not panic. Her hand brushed the latch of a nearby trunk, and she paused. With a quick motion, she yanked it open, the sudden noise reverberating through the car. The response was immediate. A figure darted from the shadows, their movement sharp and deliberate. In the fleeting light, Agatha glimpsed the outline of a figure cloaked in dark fabric, their face obscured by the brim of a hat. The figure lunged toward her, but Agatha anticipated the move. She sidestepped swiftly, her small frame surprisingly agile. The assailant stumbled, their shoulder colliding with a towering stack of luggage. The crash of falling trunks filled the car, the sound muffling Agatha's hurried retreat toward the door. Her fingers found the lock, fumbling momentarily before she twisted it open. The door creaked as it swung ajar, letting in the faint light of the corridor beyond. Agatha slipped through, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it in one fluid motion. She turned to see the startled face of a steward passing by. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed. "Are you quite all right?" Agatha straightened her hat, her composure unshaken. "Quite, thank you. Though I suggest you alert the conductor. There's someone in the luggage car who shouldn't be there." The steward paled but nodded, hurrying off to carry out her instructions. Agatha stood in the corridor for a moment, her sharp mind piecing together the implications of what had just occurred. The attempt on her life confirmed one thing: the murderer knew she was closing in on the truth. With a faint, wry smile, she adjusted her gloves and began walking back toward her compartment. The game had taken a dangerous turn, but Agatha Marple had no intention of backing down. If anything, her resolve had only strengthened. The shadows on this train were deep, but she intended to bring every one of them into the light. The train's dining car was unusually quiet, the usual hum of conversation replaced by a heavy, tense silence. Passengers sat stiffly in their chairs, eyes darting toward the far end of the car where the conductor stood with Dr. Evelyn Montague. Her face was pale, but her posture was resolute as she held her head high, a stark contrast to the murmured accusations swirling around her. "I regret this," Dr. Montague, the conductor, began, his tone grave, "but the evidence is compelling. This vial was found in your medical kit." He held up a small glass container, the faintest residue of a liquid clinging to its bottom. "That is absurd," Montague replied firmly. "I don't deny that it's mine, but it is standard for a physician to carry such items. That does not make me a murderer." A low murmur rippled through the gathered passengers, a blend of curiosity and suspicion. Agatha Marple, seated near the back of the car, observed the scene with narrowed eyes, her knitting needle still for the first time that evening. "Compelling evidence, perhaps," Agatha finally said, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension. "But circumstantial nonetheless." All eyes turned to her as she rose from her seat, her demeanor calm but commanding. "Tell me, Mr. Conductor," she continued, stepping forward, "was this vial discovered in plain view?" The conductor hesitated. "It was found during a routine check of Dr. Montague's belongings." "Indeed," Agatha said, her tone sharpening. "And yet, if I were inclined to commit such a crime, I would not leave such an incriminating item in my own possession, let alone where it could be so easily discovered." "Would you?" Montague's eyes flickered with gratitude as the murmurs began to shift, suspicion now tinged with doubt. The conductor, visibly unsettled, cleared his throat. "The matter is serious, Miss Marple. It is not merely conjecture. Precisely why conjecture should not lead to a hasty conclusion." Agatha replied smoothly. "If you wish to solve this crime, Mr. Conductor, I suggest we look beyond the surface." Agatha found herself in the quiet sanctuary of the observation car later that evening, her thoughts a labyrinth of possibilities. The darkness outside was impenetrable, the faint glow of lanterns reflecting on the polished glass as she pieced together the fragments of the case. She was not alone for long. Sir Julian Blake approached, a glass of brandy in hand and a curious look in his eye. "Miss Marple," he said, easing into the chair opposite her, "you do have a talent for creating doubt." "It is a talent born of necessity," Agatha replied, her expression mild. "Dr. Montague is not the only one on this train with secrets, after all." Blake's lips twitched into a wry smile. "Harrington, you mean? I suspect he had a great many." "You suspect correctly," Agatha said, her tone light but pointed. "Tell me, Sir Julian, were you aware of Dr. Harrington's creative tendencies?" Blake raised an eyebrow. "Creative? Let us say he had a penchant for acquiring artifacts of questionable authenticity," Agatha clarified, "and for inflating their value through less than honest means." Blake's expression darkened. "Ah, that does sound like him. A genius in his field, but always with an eye for the dramatic, and dare I say the lucrative." Agatha nodded thoughtfully. "Such practices create enemies, wouldn't you agree? Rivals, creditors, even accomplices who may have felt slighted." Blake swirled his brandy, his gaze distant. "Quite." As he fell into contemplative silence, Agatha's mind sharpened its focus. Harrington's forgeries were not mere academic missteps, they were the seeds of deeper resentment, perhaps even murder. But who among the passengers had both the motive and the means to end his life? The answer came to her later, in the form of Madame Dubois's luggage. Agatha had waited patiently for the right moment, slipping quietly into Dubois's cabin while the woman was occupied elsewhere. The room was as elegant as its occupant, richly patterned fabrics, a faint trace of expensive perfume, but Agatha's attention was on the heavy trunk near the foot of the bed. She worked quickly, her hands nimble and efficient. The hidden compartment was not immediately apparent, but Agatha's experience with such things lent her an edge. With a subtle press along the side of the trunk, a panel gave way, revealing its secrets. Inside was a second vial, identical to the one planted in Montague's medical kit. Alongside it was a sheaf of correspondence letters bearing the name Roland Vasseur, a well-known dealer in stolen artifacts. Agatha's heart quickened as she read the incriminating details: negotiations for the idol, promises of payment upon its delivery, and veiled threats should anything interfere. Dubois had been working with Vasseur, that much was clear. And she had every reason to silence Harrington before he could expose her dealings. Agatha replaced the items carefully, her thoughts racing as she exited the cabin. She had no doubt now that Dubois was at the heart of this web, but her next move would be critical. For all her cunning, Dubois had underestimated one thing: the resolve of Agatha Marple. The Grand Salon car of the last stop on the Orient Line was a study in opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the velvet upholstery, and the polished brass railings gleamed despite the muted tension that filled the air. Passengers sat in hushed anticipation, their faces pale against the golden light. At the center of the room stood Agatha Marple, her diminutive frame framed by the grand windows that revealed a blur of moonlit hills rushing past. She adjusted her gloves with quiet precision, her eyes sweeping the room before she began. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but commanding, "we find ourselves nearing the conclusion of a most unfortunate affair. The murder of Dr. Harrington, while tragic, was not without logic or purpose. Tonight I intend to lay bare the truth." A murmur rippled through the room. Madame Dubois sat poised, her gloved hands folded elegantly in her lap, her expression one of mild curiosity. Sir Julian Blake fidgeted with his cufflinks, while Dr. Montague's steely gaze betrayed a mix of relief and wariness. "The key to this mystery," Agatha continued, "is the artifact Dr. Harrington so proudly displayed. Or rather, what he claimed to display. For as I discovered, the idol found in his cabin was a forgery, a fact that held far greater significance than I initially realized." She paused, letting the words sink in. "The forgery, you see, was no accident. It was part of a calculated plan to divert suspicion and facilitate a far more lucrative scheme." Madame Dubois's smile faltered, her knuckles tightening against her chair. Agatha took a step forward, her sharp gaze fixed on Madame Dubois. "From the beginning, the idol's so-called curse was a smokescreen, a tale spread to sow fear and mislead the curious. And who better to exploit such superstition than you, Madame Dubois? The room collectively inhaled. Dubois's composure cracked for a fraction of a second, but she recovered swiftly. "Miss Marple," she said with a cool laugh, "I'm afraid your imagination has run away with you." "What possible motive could I have?" Agatha's lips curved into a faint smile. "You had every motive. Dr. Harrington's history of acquiring and selling artifacts of questionable provenance was well known, but you saw an opportunity to turn his habit to your advantage. The artifact, genuine and priceless, was switched with a forgery before the journey began. The real idol was to be delivered to a certain Roland Vasseur in Paris. Your correspondence with him, hidden in your luggage, revealed the plan quite clearly." Dubois's expression hardened, but she remained silent. "And the murder?" Agatha pressed on, her tone steady. "A necessary evil to ensure the truth would never come to light. Dr. Harrington's boastfulness made him vulnerable. Poison, hidden in a vial identical to one in Dr. Montague's medical kit, was used to silence him during dinner. Conveniently, it allowed you to shift suspicion onto her. Sir Julian leaned forward, his face pale. "But the vial wasn't it found in Dr. Montague's belongings?" Agatha inclined her head. "Indeed, planted there by Madame Dubois herself. The locked doors of the train made it easy enough to incriminate someone else, especially a colleague who had motive to resent Dr. Harrington." Dr. Montague exhaled sharply, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that evening. "Finally," Agatha concluded, "the relic's supposed curse provided the perfect cover. Who would suspect such careful, calculated greed when a curse could bear the blame?" The train slowed as it approached its next stop, a quiet station bathed in flickering gaslight. Madame Dubois, her face pale but composed, rose as the train's conductor and a pair of uniformed officers entered the salon car. "You've no proof," she said, her voice cold. "On the contrary," Agatha replied. "Your letters to Vasseur, the hidden vial of poison, and the forgery itself are proof enough. Justice, Madame Dubois, does not require a confession-only evidence." The officers escorted her from the room, leaving the remaining passengers in stunned silence. Agatha returned to her seat, where her knitting lay waiting. The familiar clack of her needles filled the air as the train resumed its journey, the tension slowly dissipating. Sir Julian approached her, his expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Miss Marple, how did you piece it all together?" "Observation, Sir Julian," she replied with a faint smile, "and a habit of noticing what others overlook. Greed and ambition have a way of revealing themselves, even when one tries to hide them." As the train neared Paris, Agatha gazed out at the city's approaching lights. The ordeal had ended, but the lessons it carried lingered. The human heart, she mused, was capable of both brilliance and folly, and it was her task to untangle the two. With a final glance at the passengers, each now carrying their own truths, Agatha Marple resumed her knitting. The train rattled on, leaving behind a trail of secrets, lies, and justice served. "Thank you for sticking with me until the very end of this story. Your support means everything, and I truly appreciate you taking the time to dive into these detective tales with me. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories filled with mystery, intrigue, and unforgettable twists. There's plenty more to come, and I'd love to have you along for the ride. Stay tuned till the end to hear more of the implausible adventures of the masked monster. Your engagement helps the channel grow, and I can't wait to share even more thrilling cases with you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think, or which mysteries you'd like to see next. Until the next case, stay curious and keep an eye on the shadows.